Have you ever felt bored or disinterested in a university lecture? Many students have had this experience, and feeling bored or disinterested is often not caused by the subject matter, but instead by how the information is being presented. A monotonous voice, reading text from a screen, an unenthusiastic lecturer, all of these and many more things are causes of boring lectures. And if you dislike these types of presentations as a student, you've got to ask yourself, why would I ever defend my thesis in the same way? If you've been bored by this style of lecture, you are certainly going to bore your examiners. A thesis defense is a form of public presentation, and all great public speakers engage their audience in the presentation. This is done by using rhetoric, and applying rhetorical techniques in your defense will make your presentation better, more engaging, and hopefully more inspiring for your examiners. Rhetoric is a speaking technique developed by the philosopher Aristotle. Rhetoric is commonly understood today as an approach to persuade or impress an audience. Under Aristotle's view of rhetoric, a great public presentation requires three things: logic, credibility, and empathy. At university, we learn a lot about logic and credibility and how to use them. Logic relates to the organization of ideas and forming connections that make sense. Think about your thesis and the logical order you presented your ideas in. You probably used an introduction, moved towards your methods, showed your results, and then discussed and concluded based off of those results. We want to follow the same order in our defense. Your ideas should be logically connected to help the examiner understand your ideas. Credibility builds authority, and this is often expressed by evidence. Your thesis builds credibility by citing evidence from other studies and comparing your results to those studies. We want to do the same thing in our defense, but we need to build our credibility in a slightly different way. You should start by establishing that you are a knowledgeable authority on the topic, while supporting your own experience and understanding with examples, evidence, and credible sources of research. We also need to remember to apply logical connections to demonstrate credibility and flow between the evidence presented in our thesis and our analysis of that evidence. The final aspect of rhetoric is empathy. This is a concept that we learn almost nothing about at university, but is arguably the most difficult aspect of rhetoric to apply. Empathy is about establishing a personal connection with your audience. How can you make your examiners feel a personal, emotional connection to the information that you're going to provide them with? Think back to those boring lectures you had. Did the lecturer give you a reason to listen to them? Did you feel that there was some relevance or importance between what they were saying and your own academic or personal interests? Presenters who do not establish a personal connection with their audience tend to be boring, because we, as an audience, have absolutely no reason to pay any attention to what they're saying. Your task, in your defense, is to establish a reason beyond what was written in your thesis to make the examiners not only think about your research, but feel that your research is important to them. But how do we do this? Well, using a rhetorical technique called a hook, we can logically start our presentation with an introduction that develops credibility in ourselves and establishes a personal connection with the audience. Here's an example from my own thesis. Pay close attention to how I use rhetoric. As a young child growing up in rural southern Alberta in Canada, I used to spend a lot of time playing in the wetland areas around my family's farm, and developed a great appreciation for the natural splendor of these areas. In the spring and summer, I would walk through the reeds, collecting frogs or tadpoles. I'd watch the birds and try to identify different types of plants and insects. And then in the winter months, I learned how to skate and play hockey on the very same creek. As I grew older, I learned that many of these wetland sites were actually conservation or reclaimed areas designed to protect natural biodiversity from the encroaching farmland. Albertans take great pride in their natural landscapes, but there remains a tension between further development and protection and returning these disturbed lands back to natural sites. Nowhere is this tension more apparent than in northern Alberta's boreal forest, where oil sands mining is causing ecological disturbance at an incredible scale. Under current provincial law, these mine sites are legally required to be returned back to a state of equivalent land capability, which will require ecological reclamation at landscape levels never before seen. How successful this process is going to be is still unknown, requiring a closer examination of how ecological reclamation is managed and occurs on these sites, and what we may expect as outcomes from this process. Would you want to keep listening to my research? If you do, it's likely because I applied empathy through hooks. Hooks are all around us in everyday media, and they're very useful for us to use in our defense. So let's take a look at some useful and very common hooks. Images. Newspapers, advertisements, and social media use images to evoke emotion every day. An English phrase says, "A picture is worth 1,000 words," and a strong, evocative image can immediately grab the audience's attention while giving context to your research. Stories. People love stories. Stories are not only novels or books, but they also occur in movies, in video games, throughout our own histories, and they're part of our daily conversation with friends and family. So why not use a story? In my defense, I chose to tell a personal story about my own childhood, because this story not only established the importance of my research, but I'm quite certain that many people can remember being a young child and experiencing nature. Stories can form a great connection with your audience. Statistics. Using a statistic can stress a problem, puzzle, or a gap, and establish justification for your research. But just ask yourself, what does this statistic mean to my audience, and why is this statistic important? Will you demonstrate that we can increase or decrease this statistic? And what are going to be the benefits of changing it? Famous quotes. Sometimes someone else has just said something much better than we could ever say it ourselves. Use this to your benefit. If a famous and well-known person said something poignant to your research, just start off with that. But remember to form a connection between the quote and your research. Also remember that your famous quote may not be equally applicable in different cultural contexts. If I quoted Elizabeth May, would you know who that is? Controversial statements. Similar to a famous quote, a controversial statement works to make the audience think, and it can even work to make them angry. This emotional provocation can help you launch into your defense by either defending or disproving the statement. The emotional connection that people make to famous quotes or controversial statements can make them feel engaged in your research. You may even persuade people to think differently by the end. Humor. Do you have a funny joke or even a funny story or image that is connected to your research? If you're a person who enjoys humor, there's nothing wrong with starting your defense with that. A key idea is to ensure that your humor has a purpose and is directly connected to your research. Having people laugh a little will lighten the defense mood, and it may actually give the examiners a different perspective on your research that they otherwise didn't get when reading your thesis. However, be cautious. Not everyone appreciates jokes in a defense, and not everyone can use humor effectively. There are many more types of hooks, but your most effective use of hooks will involve using more than one of them in your introduction. Try combining an image with your controversial statement, or use a famous quote that's a little bit humorous. Once you establish rhetoric in your introduction and create an empathetic connection with your examiners, you can continue your presentation using the logical progression of your ideas and credible evidence to support yourself. Just remember, reapply empathy in your conclusion to end strongly and reestablish that personal connection between your main findings and the examiner's personal life.